Mark Hamill read the script for The Last Jedi and told Rian Johnson directly that he fundamentally disagreed with virtually everything Johnson had planned for Luke Skywalker. Not through an agent, not in a carefully worded note. He said it to Johnson's face during production, and then said it again publicly on ABC's Nightline in April 2017. The man who had spent 40 years embodying Luke Skywalker, who had watched that character grow from a farm boy on Tatooine into a Jedi Knight who chose mercy over power at the cost of his own life, sat across from the director who was about to rewrite that character's ending and told him plainly, "This isn't the Luke I know." Jedis don't give up. I mean, even if he had a problem, he would maybe take a year to try and regroup, but if he made a mistake, he would try and right that wrong. Hamill believed Luke would have become even more of a hero, more devoted, in the wake of Ben Solo's betrayal. Not withdrawn, not broken, not hiding at the edge of the galaxy with a ceremonial contempt for the lightsaber he'd once used to save the universe. Hamill eventually walked it back, publicly endorsed Johnson, said he regretted sharing his doubts, called Johnson the exact man they needed for this job, made the film because that's what professionals do. The camera caught his exact words. "Maybe he's Jake Skywalker. He's not my Luke Skywalker." One of the most polite forms of professional disagreement ever captured in an interview. The disagreement itself, the conviction that this was fundamentally the wrong direction, he described as fundamental. Not a note about a scene, not a preference about tone, fundamental. Between Hamill's disagreement and The Last Jedi's December 2017 release, somebody held the authority to make a different call. Somebody with organizational power over a 3-film saga that had opened to $2 billion worldwide could have said, "The character who is the emotional through line of this entire trilogy can't be reduced to a hermit who attempted to murder his nephew in his sleep without a conversation about what that means for Episode 9. That conversation, if it happened at all, left no trace in any public record. And if it didn't happen, if nobody at the top of Lucasfilm thought to hold that line on the saga's central character, then the failure was institutional before it was creative. That institution belongs to Kathleen Kennedy, and that failure is what the existing discourse around the Star Wars sequel trilogy has consistently declined to examine. Every autopsy ends at the directors. Rian Johnson contradicted J.J. Abrams. Abrams responded to Johnson. The two films pulled in opposite directions and left the third film with an impossible task. These observations are accurate, but they stop at the wrong level. The question they never ask is, who had the authority and responsibility to prevent that from happening? Who was supposed to be steering this thing? And who built, or failed to build, the creative framework that would have made a coherent trilogy possible in the first place? The answer to those questions isn't Rian Johnson. It isn't J.J. Abrams. Those men were hired and given creative authority over individual films without binding obligations to a trilogy-wide plan. The person with the authority to enforce that plan, to commission it, mandate it, and hold every director accountable to it, was the president of Lucasfilm. Her name appears almost nowhere in this conversation. She kept her job for more than a decade. On October 30th, 2012, the day Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm officially closed, Kathleen Kennedy was confirmed as president. She had been co-chair since June of that year. George Lucas, who had built Lucasfilm from a regional production company into a $4.05 billion mythology, named Kennedy as his hand-picked successor. Disney paid that $4.05 billion for what Lucasfilm represented, not for equipment or real estate. A generational story. 4 decades of world building, 3 generations of emotional investment, and the accumulated trust of audiences who had grown up treating the Skywalker saga as part of their own biography. Lucas didn't leave empty-handed in the creative sense. He had already developed treatments for episodes 7, 8, and 9, a documented plan for where the saga would go, what new characters would face, how the Skywalker story would end. He had a direction prepared. Disney and Lucasfilm assessed those treatments and chose not to use them as the foundation for the sequel trilogy. The specific reasoning was never made public. What became clear over subsequent years was that Lucas's relationship with what became of his creation caused him genuine pain. He later described selling Lucasfilm as something akin to handing his children over to a different family. The colonist language attributed to him in the period after the sequels released captures a specific kind of alienation, the feeling that people who didn't fully understand what the thing was had taken possession of it and begun redecorating. Rejecting Lucas's treatments wasn't automatically a mistake. An original direction could have produced something extraordinary. What wasn't optional was building a replacement architecture. You can't discard the creator's roadmap and decline to draw a new one. Kennedy's first structural decision after taking the presidency was the right one. She formed the Lucasfilm Story Group in 2012, charged specifically with managing franchise canon. A dedicated creative body whose purpose was maintaining narrative continuity, tracking what was canonical, establishing what each new piece of content must honor, and what it could contradict. The story group became the authority over novels, comics, reference material, animated series, and expanded universe content. It was real, it was active, and it had genuine power over the franchise's peripheral output. This was exactly the kind of oversight architecture a franchise that complex required. What the story group apparently didn't do was impose binding creative governance on the directors of the mainline films. There is no public record of a trilogy-wide document established before Episode 7 commenced production. A document establishing where the Skywalker saga was heading, what each film was required to accomplish narratively, what character fates were too consequential to be decided by a single director. Kennedy had the institutional structure in place. The question of whether that structure was ever empowered to govern the trilogy's most critical decisions is answered by what the trilogy became. The Force Awakens opened in December 2015 to $2 billion worldwide, $936 million domestically. Franchise record, cultural event, the return of Han Solo and Leia Organa, and, in the film's final 2 minutes, the promise of Luke Skywalker. A map followed to its end. A young woman climbing a cliff above a gray sea. A hooded figure turning to face her. The lightsaber extended. The film ending before he takes it. 2 hours of deliberate setup, and the audience left having been given a specific promise about Episode 8. That $2 billion is the financial expression of trust. It says, "We believe you know where this is going. We believe the people making these films understand what's essential. We're invested." Rian Johnson was already working on Episode 8 when The Force Awakens released. He had been given the assignment with creative authority and no binding narrative obligations to the threads Abrams had opened. Snoke's identity and origin, Rey's parentage, the Knights of Ren, who appeared in The Force Awakens and wouldn't be addressed meaningfully until the rise of Skywalker. The reason Luke was hiding, what had broken him, what his return would mean. These weren't questions with settled answers internally agreed upon at Lucasfilm. They were open variables that each director could resolve according to their own creative judgment. Yahoo's entertainment reporting confirms that while there were conversations between Abrams and Johnson about the overall direction of the trilogy, there was no binding arrangement between them. Each director was working from their own vision of what the story required. This isn't a failure of communication between two filmmakers. It's a structural gap in the organization managing them. A producing studio that has built a trilogy framework doesn't leave the question of where the saga is going to informal conversations between directors. It provides a document. It establishes requirements. It designates which decisions belong to individual directors and which decisions belong to the trilogy itself. J.J. Abrams eventually said the quiet part out loud. In an Esquire interview published after the trilogy concluded, he said, "Having a plan, I have learned, in some cases the hard way, is the most critical thing, because otherwise you don't know what you're setting up." The man who directed both Episode 7 and Episode 9, who opened the mystery box and then had to close it with someone else's choices filling the middle, acknowledged in plain language that no plan existed. He framed it as personal learning. He attributed the lesson to himself in the past tense, because naming it as an institutional failure would have required him to name the institution, and Kathleen Kennedy was still president of Lucasfilm when that interview was published. Before the organizational case can land completely, it needs a face. It needs a specific demonstration of what the absence of a plan cost in human terms. That demonstration is Luke Skywalker, and the specific beats of his Last Jedi arc require direct attention, not as plot summary, but as evidence. At the end of Return of the Jedi, Luke stood before the Emperor and faced the single most consequential moral choice in the original trilogy. He had the power to strike the Emperor down. The dark side had been offering him that power for 2 films. He threw down his lightsaber instead, refused, and declared, "I am a Jedi, like my father before me." Because he chose mercy over power, Vader killed the Emperor. A son's refusal to abandon his father redeemed the father. That is the arc the 40-year audience relationship was built on. A man who won the defining battle of his life by refusing to fight it. The Last Jedi found Luke hiding at the edge of the known galaxy, not in a strategic retreat, not planning a return, hiding absolutely, on an island accessible only by map, deliberately cut off from the Force, milking a large alien creature for green liquid in a scene that communicates his absolute withdrawal from everything the character had represented. When Rey extends his old lightsaber toward him in the film's opening minutes, he takes it, looks at it for a moment, and throws it over his shoulder. The gesture is practiced. He has thought about this. He has made his peace with being nothing. The reason he fled is revealed across the film's second act. Luke had stood over his sleeping nephew Ben Solo, sensed the darkness growing in him, and for a single unguarded moment had ignited his lightsaber with the intention of killing the boy. Ben woke up, saw the blade, brought the structure down around them, and ran. That act, the moment Luke Skywalker almost murdered a child in his sleep, sent Ben toward Kylo Ren and sent Luke toward that island. Hamill's objection to this wasn't stylistic. He wasn't arguing for a more dignified presentation of the same story beat. He was arguing that this was the wrong story beat entirely, that the character of Luke Skywalker, as established across 3 films, as understood by the actor who had embodied him for 4 decades, wasn't a man built for this particular failure. Even if he had a problem, he would maybe take a year to try and regroup, but if he made a mistake, he would try and right that wrong. Hamill believed Luke's response to losing Ben would have been the opposite of withdrawal: greater commitment, harder effort, the stubborn pursuit of a person the universe had written off, exactly as Luke had refused to write off his own father. That was the character. The man who walked into the Death Star unarmed, who faced Vader twice rather than leave him to the darkness, wasn't architecturally capable of giving up. Johnson's version of Luke is cinematically defensible in isolation, a legend confronting the myth of himself, a hero forced to reckon with what heroism costs when it fails. These are real ideas with legitimate traditions in serious drama. Hamill acknowledged as much when he publicly made peace with the choice and with Johnson personally. Their relationship, by all accounts, remains genuine and warm. The disagreement was creative, not personal. But the creative disagreement points to something institutional. Nobody had established, before a single frame of Episode 8 was shot, that Luke Skywalker's trajectory across 3 films was a decision too consequential for any single director to make alone. That certain things about this character, specifically the question of what his final arc would be, and whether he would survive to Episode 9, required a governing document, a trilogy-level conversation, an executive decision above the director level. Hamill held the character's integrity as a personal conviction. That conviction had no organizational force. Johnson made his film. Luke died at sunset on that island, and Episode 9 had to find an ending for the Skywalker saga without a Skywalker. Supreme Leader Snoke appeared in The Force Awakens as something genuinely threatening. projected in massive hologram from an undisclosed location, scarred, imposing, speaking to Kylo Ren with the casual authority of someone who had shaped events from a distance for decades. He commanded the First Order, a military apparatus that had risen from the Empire's ashes and had already demonstrated the capacity to destroy entire star systems. In every structural sense, he occupied the Emperor's role in this trilogy, the distant, powerful dark side master who would eventually have to be confronted. Lucasfilm chose not to explain Snoke's origins in The Force Awakens. His history with the Force, his relationship to the fallen Empire, his specific power and goals, these remained unaddressed. That was a reasonable storytelling choice for an opening chapter. Establish the threat, deliver the payoff later. Audiences understood they were watching Chapter 1 of 3. The mysteries were intentional. Resolution was someone else's responsibility. Rian Johnson killed Snoke in his throne room in The Last Jedi. The mechanism was inventive, Kylo using the Force to rotate Snoke's own lightsaber, cutting the Supreme Leader in half mid-sentence, while the old man was still predicting Kylo's failure to turn Rey. The primary villain of a 3-film saga died in the second act of the second film, with no backstory delivered, no explanation offered, no successor architecture built. Just dead on his throne room floor, and the scene moved on. Johnson's reasoning was internally coherent for the film he was making. Eliminating Snoke freed Kylo Ren from the mentor-subordinate dynamic, and elevated him as the saga's central antagonist. That logic works as an individual creative choice. If you're making a standalone film, or if the team taking over Episode 9 is in the room when you make it and has agreed to what comes next. There is no evidence that J.J. Abrams, who wasn't yet attached to Episode 9 when Johnson was making Episode 8, received a comprehensive understanding of what his successor's film had committed to. What exists as evidence of that coordination is what Rise of Skywalker actually contains. The opening crawl of The Rise of Skywalker includes the line, "Somehow Palpatine returned." 5 words in a text scroll. No scene, no image, no setup from the previous 2 films. The Emperor of the original trilogy, killed by Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi, killed 36 years of real time before Rise of Skywalker's release, is simply back. The word somehow is doing extraordinary narrative work there. It's the word a screenwriter uses when they know the audience deserves an explanation and have decided to skip it. Palpatine's return wasn't planned from the beginning of the trilogy. Abrams confirmed he didn't know Palpatine would return when he directed The Force Awakens. The decision came during Episode 9's development, after Colin Trevorrow's firing, after Abrams came back to assess what the story had become. Palpatine was the solution, the only villain in Star Wars history with sufficient narrative gravity to anchor a 9-episode saga's finale. The problem is that you can't introduce a saga's ultimate villain in your 3rd chapter's opening scroll and expect an audience that has been watching for 4 years to experience it as earned. The decision to bring Palpatine back is the clearest single proof that the sequel trilogy's villain architecture had no plan. Snoke was killed without a replacement. The replacement had to be invented retroactively and delivered as a given. Forbes called The Rise of Skywalker the first $1 billion disappointment. Worldwide gross, $1.074 billion. Domestic, $515.2 million. Less than half of what The Force Awakens had earned domestically 4 years earlier. The Force Awakens opened the trilogy at $2 billion worldwide. The Rise of Skywalker closed it at barely half that. That isn't a gradual decline in audience interest of the kind that naturally affects long-running franchises. That is a specific erosion of trust. An audience that arrived in record numbers for the first film, stayed for the second despite division, and left in significant numbers by the third because the story had spent 3 films demonstrating that nobody at the top was steering. Kylo Ren's collapse across 3 films is the other casualty, and it's more insidious than Snoke's death, because it happened one individually defensible choice at a time. The Force Awakens introduced Kylo as genuinely menacing and psychologically layered. A dark side warrior still in the process of hardening his villainy. unstable in ways that suggested danger rather than weakness, obsessively devoted to an image of Vader he was trying to become. His murder of Han Solo is a defining act precisely because it costs him something visible. You watch him pay a price for the choice. He's a villain becoming what he wants to be, which is dramatically the richest version of that character. The Last Jedi gave Kylo the Force bond with Rey, which deepened the emotional complexity and built toward his offer in the throne room. Come with me, start over, let the past die. Those scenes work. They built toward something. But The Last Jedi also had him kill Snoke and claim the title of Supreme Leader, meaning he arrived as the saga's primary antagonist with one film left to establish his full menace. Rise of Skywalker demoted him within its first act. Kylo learns that Palpatine is alive and controls a planet-destroying fleet called the Final Order, and has apparently been orchestrating everything from a hidden planet, including Snoke's existence, which Palpatine describes as his own construct, including the First Order's rise, including the entire apparatus of the sequel trilogy's threat. The man who had claimed the villain's throne in Film 2 was revealed as a middle manager who hadn't known who he was working for. His menace evaporated on contact with that revelation. Then, roughly a third of the way through the film, the memory of Han Solo appeared to him, and he threw his helmet into the sea, and he became Ben Solo again, and Ben Solo spent the rest of the film riding toward his redemption before dying to bring Rey back from death. Across 3 films, the villain becoming, the villain arrived, the villain demoted, the redeemed son who died for love. These are 4 separate character trajectories. They don't compound into a coherent arc because nobody in a position of authority decided in 2013 or 2014 which one the story required. Both Abrams and Johnson made choices consistent with their individual vision of who Kylo Ren was. Neither vision survived complete contact with the other's film. The audience got all 4 versions, and none of them carried the full weight they might have in a story with a governing design. If the sequel trilogy were the only evidence of this pattern under Kennedy's tenure, you might reasonably attribute it to the specific difficulty of continuing a beloved saga. The pattern didn't stay contained to the main trilogy. Rogue One, released December 2016, was directed by Gareth Edwards. Tony Gilroy was brought in during production to direct reshoots, not cleanup shots, but substantive material. Gilroy rewrote the script and wrote an entirely new ending for the film, directing enough of the finished product that both he and Chris Weitz received screenplay credit alongside the story by credit assigned to John Knoll. The creative intervention was extensive enough to functionally reshape the film's final act. Edwards retained his director's credit. The film's ending was written by someone who wasn't hired to direct the film. Solo, released May 2018, began production under Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, hired specifically for their distinctive comedic sensibility, for the specific quality that made them the right choice. They were fired midway through production and replaced by Ron Howard, who directed enough of the finished film to functionally become its director. The official characterization was creative differences. Solo became the first Star Wars film to lose money at the box office. Episode 9 had Colin Trevorrow hired to write and direct in 2014. Trevorrow co-wrote the script with Derek Connolly. Connolly was the first to be fired. Then Trevorrow himself was let go, officially cited by Lucasfilm as differing visions, a few months before filming was scheduled to begin. Lucasfilm's exact statement? Lucasfilm and Colin Trevorrow have mutually chosen to part ways. A script doctor, Jack Thorne, was brought in to attempt repairs, and the problems were deemed unfixable. Abrams was rehired to direct Episode 9 from scratch, inheriting the narrative state of a trilogy he had started, but not controlled through its middle chapter. Trevorrow's script, co-written with Connolly, and later titled Duel of the Fates, after it leaked through people in Trevorrow's inner circle, reportedly featured Luke Skywalker in a spiritual guide role, guiding Rey's development. A role that would have required a materially different resolution for Luke's story than what The Last Jedi delivered. The script was built without knowledge of what Episode 9 would be required to accomplish in trilogy terms, because no such requirement existed. When it proved incompatible with where Lucasfilm needed to go, Trevorrow was removed and his work discarded. Industry reporting at the time, from sources including Vulture, attributed the firing partly to Trevorrow being difficult and egotistical. But the script itself was the fundamental problem. And the script was a problem because Trevorrow had been given the assignment without a governing framework telling him what Episode 9 owed the trilogy. 3 directors fired or substantially overridden across 5 major Star Wars productions. Lord and Miller on Solo, Edwards effectively on Rogue One, Trevorrow on Episode 9. Rian Johnson given such complete creative autonomy on Episode 8 that his individual choices determined the fate of the entire trilogy's 3rd act. This is the organizational fingerprint of an institution that hires directors based on their individual vision, discovers mid-production that the vision doesn't fit an unspecified requirement, and either intervenes expensively or grants total autonomy, with no middle ground, where a trilogy framework guides the work without overriding the creativity. The Marvel Studios comparison is worth making precisely because it shows what the alternative looks like. Kevin Feige built a creative architecture before hiring individual directors. The directors worked with real authority and genuine creative latitude, but within a framework that established connectivity, required setups, and character continuity that no single director could override. Individual directors could make tonally distinct, character-driven films, precisely because the structure existed to hold them together. No director on a Phase 3 film could unilaterally eliminate the saga's primary villain without coordination, because the architecture made that conversation mandatory. Lucasfilm had a story group with genuine authority over the expanded universe. The mainline trilogy films operated outside its governing reach. The prequel trilogy is this audience's persistent fault line, and a script about the sequel trilogy's structural failures has to address it directly. The prequels have real problems their own defenders generally acknowledge. The dialogue in episodes 1 and 2 is frequently stiff in ways that created visible strain for actors and audiences alike. The CGI aesthetic aged poorly in ways the original trilogy's practical effects didn't. The pacing of The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones sacrifices momentum for exposition at critical structural points. Jar Jar Binks, midichlorians, a romance subplot in Attack of the Clones that generated some of cinema's most discussed, unintentionally awkward exchanges. These failures are real and documented, and dismissing them on behalf of the thesis would alienate the part of this audience that held the prequels accountable for exactly what was wrong with them. What the prequels had, which the sequel trilogy demonstrably didn't, was a plan. Multiple academic sources confirm that Lucas had 3 planned prequels to the Star Wars trilogy developed before Episode 1 entered production. The thematic architecture was established before shooting began. Anakin Skywalker's fall would mirror the fall of the Galactic Republic. The Jedi Order's institutional blindness, its rigidity, its attachment to hierarchy, its failure to detect Palpatine operating from inside its own structure, would be as much the cause of its destruction as Palpatine's scheming. Every film advanced a continuous argument about what happens when institutions fail the people who depend on them, and about what fear does to someone who loves. The Phantom Menace introduced a gifted, frightened child and a religious order that couldn't fully embrace him. "I sense much fear in you," Yoda told Anakin, and then the council declined to train him until circumstances made refusal impossible. Attack of the Clones showed that child becoming a man the Jedi system had shaped into a specific kind of danger. Brilliant, devoted, attached in all the ways the Order had forbidden, waiting for the moment the institution would fail him decisively. When Anakin's mother died in his arms, the system had no answer for him. When Padme's death approached in his visions, the system offered only detachment. Revenge of the Sith delivered the consequence. Anakin turned not from irredeemable evil, but from a sequence of institutional failures, precisely timed, each one Palpatine had positioned himself to exploit. The execution of those ideas was often poor. The architecture was never absent. Apply the same test to the sequel trilogy. What was the thematic throughline? What was the argument all three films were collectively making about the Force, about legacy, about what the Skywalker name meant? The Force Awakens was about legacy and the weight of inherited history, a new generation stepping into old stories. The Last Jedi was about the failure of heroes, myth versus man, and the necessity of radical new beginnings. The Rise of Skywalker was about identity, chosen lineage, and, apparently, the eternal resilience of Palpatine. Three separate thematic centers. A trilogy built on architectural planning has one argument that all three films advance. This trilogy had three directors, each working from their own understanding of what Star Wars should say, with no governing document connecting them. George Lucas sold Lucasfilm with treatments for episodes 7 through 9 already prepared. Disney and Lucasfilm chose not to use them. That decision might have been defensible in isolation, a new creative team starting fresh, finding its own direction. But discarding the creator's framework without replacing it produced a specific consequence. Whoever held creative authority over the franchise had to build new architecture from scratch before a frame of Episode 7 was shot. Kennedy formed the story group. She hired J.J. Abrams. She apparently didn't commission the document that would have told every director what the saga's endpoint was, what its thematic argument was, and what guardrails they were required to respect. There is a version of this story in which the failures trace ultimately to Disney's C-suite rather than to Kennedy specifically. Bob Iger reportedly stated that where Star Wars was concerned, the buck stops with me. A framing that, if accurate, places ultimate creative authority at the Disney CEO level, not just the Lucasfilm president level. Kennedy operated within a reporting structure. Decisions of franchise magnitude were made above her as well as at her level. This complication is real, and the script shouldn't paper over it. The organizational failure may be more distributed than a single executive. But distributing the accountability upward doesn't dissolve Kennedy's responsibility. It shares it. Whatever the reporting structure above her, Kennedy held the title of President of Lucasfilm. She formed the story group. She hired every director on the sequel trilogy. She fired or effectively replaced several of them. She was the executive charged with running the creative institution that produced these films. She held that title through 2 contract renewals that followed the franchise's most significant commercial and critical failures. The financial trajectory records what the absence of a plan cost. The Force Awakens, $2 billion worldwide. The Last Jedi released against a backdrop of the deepest audience division the franchise had ever experienced. Solo, the first Star Wars film to lose money at the box office, released May 2018. The Rise of Skywalker, $1.074 billion worldwide, $515.2 million domestic, less than half of what The Force Awakens had earned at home 4 years earlier. In October 2018, after Solo became the first Star Wars film to lose money, Disney renewed Kennedy's contract. In November 2021, after The Rise of Skywalker's billion-dollar disappointment, Kennedy's contract was extended again through at least 2024. Kennedy continued leading Lucasfilm through that period. In 2023, Dave Filoni was elevated to Chief Creative Officer of Lucasfilm, and Kennedy began preparing him for succession in that role. In the immediate aftermath of Rise of Skywalker's release, Kennedy gave an interview to IGN announcing that future Star Wars films would deviate from the trilogy format going forward. "We're not going to have some finite number," she said. That statement is the closest thing to organizational acknowledgement that the trilogy structure had produced results nobody wanted to repeat. It isn't a confession, it's a pivot. And it arrived without any public examination of why the trilogy had failed, which would have required acknowledging that it failed not because trilogies are inherently flawed, but because this particular trilogy had been produced without the planning architecture that any multi-film saga requires. Abrams said more, in the way that individual participants sometimes do when institutions won't. That Esquired mission, having a plan, I have learned in some cases the hard way, is the most critical thing because otherwise you don't know what you're setting up, is as close to a public confession of structural failure as the sequel trilogy produced. He attributed it to himself. He framed it as personal learning, because naming it as an institutional failure would have meant naming the institution. So he named himself and moved on. And the institution that employed him continued without public accountability for what it had built and what it had failed to build. The grief that surrounds the Star Wars sequel trilogy has a specific texture that distinguishes it from ordinary film disappointment. People leave bad movies constantly. They walk out, give the film 2 stars on their phone, forget it by the weekend. What the sequel trilogy produced in significant portions of its audience operates at a different register. Fans describing it as having part of their spirit crushed, adopting fan edits as personal canon because the official story broke something they needed intact, writing about experiencing alternative story treatments as healing years after the film's finished. That isn't the language of disappointed moviegoers. That is the language of people who experienced a specific kind of betrayal. The anatomy of that betrayal is concrete. The audience didn't experience the sequel trilogy as a quality failure alone. They experienced it as a failure of stewardship. The sense that the people responsible for this story didn't fully understand what it was, or didn't protect it with the organizational rigor that a $4.05 billion acquisition had implicitly promised. 40 years of emotional investment. A franchise Disney paid that exact price specifically to own and extend. And the mechanism for extending it was 3 directors making 3 separately architected films with no binding obligation to one another. Mark Hamill spent 40 years building Luke Skywalker into something precise and real. He believed the sequel trilogy would give Luke the ending his arc had been building toward. The return, the mentorship, the legend finding that his greatest act was still ahead of him. What Johnson wrote was a man who had burned his own temple, who needed a Force ghost to remind him what he stood for, who died alone on an island and became nothing. Hamill made the film. He gave everything he had to a version of Luke he had told the director he fundamentally disagreed with, and he performed it with the craft of someone who had earned the right to disagree. Then the camera caught Luke at sunset, facing the horizon, and he dissolved. And that was the end of Luke Skywalker. Nobody at Lucasfilm, with authority over the trilogy as a trilogy, had established that Luke's ending wasn't Rian Johnson's decision alone to make. That is the failure. Johnson's vision was coherent within its own terms. Abrams' mysteries were genuinely intriguing. The failure was the absence of a framework that protected what the saga owed its audience, that designated certain decisions above the individual director level, that required coordination across 3 films, that treated the Skywalker saga's conclusion as a trilogy-level responsibility before it was a director-level creative choice. George Lucas built a story with emotional architecture across 2 completed trilogies, cause and effect, consequence and redemption, a logic of the Force that gave suffering meaning and made heroism cost something real. When Disney purchased that story for $4.05 billion, they assumed the obligation to protect what was architecturally essential about it. That obligation landed on Kathleen Kennedy's desk in October 2012. Kennedy's Lucasfilm discarded the creator's framework, formed a story group with real authority over the expanded universe, and declined to build the equivalent governing document for the 3 mainline films at the center of it all. The directors made their choices. The films were released. The franchise contracted from $2 billion to $1 billion in 4 years, and ended with an opening crawl that used the word somehow to explain the return of its own villain. 2 contract renewals followed those results. The organization continued. No public accounting of what had failed at the structural level was ever offered. No executive stood before a camera and said, "We didn't build a plan, and that was the error, and here is what that error cost." The franchise moved forward, as franchises do, with new shows and new directors and new announcements. The institutional post-mortem conducted quietly in whatever meetings happen out of public view. The only people who paid a visible price for the absence of a plan were the audience. They paid it in the currency of something they still struggle to name years later. Not disappointment exactly, not rage exactly, but something underneath both. The accurate perception that something was handled carelessly by people who didn't understand what they had been given, or understood it and didn't build the structures adequate to protect it. That perception isn't nostalgia. That perception isn't resistance to change. That perception is an accurate reading of documented organizational decisions made at the president of Lucasfilm level, across a decade of franchise management, with no public accountability attached to the results. How do you kill a franchise? You hire visionary directors without building the framework those directors need to make a coherent trilogy. You fire some of them mid-production when their vision proves incompatible with an unspoken requirement. You grant others total creative autonomy over decisions that belong to the trilogy as a whole. You leave the question of where the saga ends unanswered until the director of the final film has to invent the answer from scratch. You bring back a villain killed 36 years earlier and announce it in 5 words. You watch the franchise contract from $2 billion to $1 billion and renew the contracts. That's the answer. That's the whole answer. Subscribe if you want more stories where the real failure sits above the level everyone's been looking at.